All right, so this is session 3 tonight. It's on understanding projects. Remember, we talked about the nature of deacon work as administrated, and we've got projects essentially that we do. That's our role. So we have some objectives tonight. We're going to look at the term project and try and define what a project is. Then we'll outline the elements of a project. There are 5 elements that I'll lay out. And then we want to look at some errors that people make when they are getting into the planning process for a project. And in the next session, we're going to talk about the whole process of actually executing a project. So that's what we want to do tonight. Okay, so let's begin tonight talking about projects. And we're going to get very practical this evening. And over the course of the years in the church and even outside of the church, I've seen very, very smart men miss some basic things that we want to highlight this evening and try and make sure that we kind of close those gaps up in terms of executing projects. Each one of us is going to have to play a role in a project, whether we are leading the project or participating in it. So let's talk first about what is a project. What is a project? So I'm going to define a project very simply as any activity the deacons take on that meets a need in the church. Any activity that we take on that meets a need in the church. We want to look at all of them as projects, something that we're going to start, something we're going to carry out, and something we're going to conclude. All of those are projects. Now, as deacons, the projects that we have are going to come in all kinds of sizes, all kinds of shapes, and all kinds of, they're going to be made up of all kinds of different things. There may be projects that one person just has to do, and it takes them 5 minutes. And we might say in a deacon meeting, hey, Gary, can you take care of X? All right? But there may be other projects, like we're talking about with our emergency plan, that may take all of us to work for years to get them done. All right? All that entire spectrum. So examples, I've already mentioned this emergency plan that we're going to talk about later on tonight. That's going to be a big project, isn't it? For our church, that'll be akin to the Acts 6 project of daily distribution of food. It'll be very, very similar to that. What are some other projects that we're talking about right now that we're going to be taking up? Stan, you remember we talked last time about the church cookout, right? That's a project. That's an activity we're taking up that meets a need in the church. And that need is get people together, fellowship, right? Having them spend time together. The last time I asked Josh is taking care of the security schedule. That's just one guy with one thing to do, but that's an example of a project. And the thing about projects is they all have the same basic pieces, all have the same basic components. So a project is any activity the deacons take on that meets a need in the church. All right, so let's look at project elements here for a moment. This is what we're going to focus on this time, is what makes up a project. All right, so there are 5 components of a project that I want to talk about tonight. I'm going to try and write these up in a way that I can put some notes in a little bit later. All right, when we talk about a project, whether it's the emergency plan, or it's the church cookout, or it's even the schedule for the security booth, we have 5 parts. First, we have the scope. And for us to effectively carry out projects, we have to know all of these and cover all of these in our development and execution. So scope. What is the scope? Somebody tell me, what is the scope of a project? What does scope mean in this context? Any ideas? The total picture of what needs to be done. And what I want you to do as we go through these is just think about Nehemiah. Let's think of Nehemiah when he was rebuilding the wall, and let's consider these 5 elements against what Nehemiah did. What would have been the scope, the total parameters of what needed to be done for Nehemiah? It was kind of simple, wasn't it? And we could just put in a few words to rebuild the wall. There was a wall around Jerusalem that had gates, and that wall had been torn down and burned, and all the gates were burned, and everything was destroyed. So the project for Nehemiah that the whole book is about is him going in and rebuilding that wall. And why was that important to rebuild the wall? What did that signify? What was the meaning of it? What was the importance of it?
Well, security for one thing.
Security. It was security, securing the city.
Giving people hope.
Giving people hope, yes. So it was a very important. That was something that met a need in the kingdom. That's a project. Remember, anything that we do that meets a need in the kingdom. So the total picture of what needs to be done is the scope. So Nehemiah was the wall. All right, the second is that I'm going to identify is the time frame. And that's pretty obvious. Gary mentioned it already. That's when does it start and when does it end? Now, in Nehemiah's case, he didn't really have a solid time frame given to him by someone else, did he? God didn't come along and say, Nehemiah, you're going to start it on October the 1st and you've got to have it done by November 15th. That's not the way that worked, was it? Do you remember what happened to Nehemiah? How the timing of the whole thing worked out? Well, Nehemiah had some men that came from Jerusalem, and he inquired and he said, what's the status of the city? What's going on there? So he had a desire to know how was the status of God's kingdom. And then those men gave him the report. And do you remember what he did, Stan, after he heard the report? He sat down and wept. He sat down and cried. Right? And there's a very important lesson for that as deacons here and as men of God, is that we need to be weeping over the state of God's kingdom, because it is that weeping and that sorrow that's going to drive us to action. So the things that we take up, we don't take them up just to do them, just to stay busy. We take them up because we see God's kingdom in the United States and the West in general as falling apart, very much like the days of Nehemiah. It's very similar in terms of the condition. So he sits down, and then what does he do after he cries? He prays. He prays to God, and then God opens a door. So timing for Nehemiah wasn't set. He didn't have a firm start and a firm end, which most of the time in our projects we want to have something like that. We'll talk about that when we get to errors. When it comes to time frame, one of the errors that people make regarding that is just basically not having a time frame. That's an error. All right, but he saw a need and he prayed. God opened the door, and then he went to Jerusalem, and he was finished in, I think it was 56 days was the project. The project was completed. All right, the third thing we're going to look at here is resources. So every project has a scope. What are we going to do? It has a time frame. When are we going to try and get this done? We're going to start and finish. And then it has resources that are required. Let's think about Nehemiah. Nehemiah, resources. The tools, equipment, money, materials, skills, and labor needed to successfully complete a project. We can't complete a project without resources, can we? We have all kinds of resources. We have resources, physical resources. We have human resources, human capital, material capital, money, all of that stuff. Well, what did Nehemiah need for him to rebuild a wall?
Lumber, stone.
He needed lumber to build the gates. He needed stone to lay in the walls. What else? He needed oxen, so he needed what we would call equipment today, wouldn't it? Mortar. He would need labor. And he wouldn't just need labor. He doesn't just need guys who can lift rocks. He's doing essentially a masonry project, isn't he? And I've done a little masonry, not much. And I can tell you that you need skill to do masonry well, or you put that wall up and it falls down. So you see, when he prayed to God, when he sat down and wept and then prayed to God about it, and then the king came along and the door opened for him to do something, he was taking on a monstrous task, wasn't he? There was a whole lot to it. And that's something that we have to remember when we take on these projects, when we take on, for example, the emergency preparedness. All right, that's a significant project. And if we're going to start that, we have to have that commitment to finish it. We can't be men who start and don't finish things. Like Nehemiah, he started a big project and he finished it. Where did he end up getting a lot of those materials, physical materials, Nehemiah? Do you remember? The way God worked it out was the king gave it to him. The king gave him the stuff. The king gave him letters to take to get the wood and all of that. And then he even sent a guard with him to protect him while he was transporting that material. All right? So you see, God can give us, when we take on a great task for him, he can give us the resources. He can give it from anywhere he wants to bring it. All right? So resources. And then I'm breaking it down here in number 4, I'm calling components. And what I mean by that, maybe that's not the perfect word. But components would be the smaller parts of the project that make up the full scope. The smaller parts of the project that make up the full scope. If you think about it, every project, every big project, regardless of the size of it, is just a bunch of little bitty projects, isn't it? We're going to talk about sequence next, but it's components. Let's think about Nehemiah for a moment. What kinds of things were smaller parts of the larger project? One part of it would be recruiting and organizing labor, wouldn't it? That's a part. That has to be done for this to work. He's got to do quality control at some point, doesn't he? Somebody has to be looking and making sure the blocks are laid right. And when you start a foundation, if you start it off wrong, things are going to crumble. And then he's got to organize those materials, doesn't he? He's got to put them somewhere that he can keep them safe. He's got to put them in some way that he can get to them if he needs them. He can't just pile them all up. He's got to check for damage in the material, damage in the wall. He's got to, you remember when he got there, I don't know if you remember this either. I've read Nehemiah a lot because I love it. But Nehemiah, one of the first things he does when he gets there, he doesn't tell anybody, but that night he goes out and he goes all around the whole wall. He said, nobody but him. He's just looking, he's checking out the condition of what he's trying to fix. So these are the smaller pieces that we have to be aware of for a project. And again, we'll talk about the errors that are made here. And then the fifth part is, very much related, is order. Order or sequence. Very important part of a project. So, for example, let's say that Nehemiah goes in, and before he surveys the damage, he sends a guy out there to start putting rock up. What is he likely to have happen? He doesn't look at the damage, he doesn't consider the condition, he says, just go put some rock up. He might do that, and then he finds out that the foundation wasn't good, and so he's got to go back and redo it. So it's not just the pieces, but it's the sequence that has to be thought through. The sequence of actions required to complete the task efficiently. So just in the ideas of the things we've talked about already, the first thing you'd have to do is check for the damage. We're just roughly thinking about this, okay? And then he'd have to obtain his materials, make sure he's got his materials. Then he'd have to recruit and organize labor. And then he'd have to perform some work, and then he'd have to do some quality control. He'd have to do that in a sequence, wouldn't he? And if he didn't do that, he'd end up with a mess. Isn't that right? So we have to identify. The reason I'm going through this, it seems probably basic to you. But I have found that nothing in the church is too basic. All right? We as deacons, we have to think about all 5 of these when we start a project. And whoever is leading the project has got to make sure that all of these things are looked at and addressed to lead the other men to do it. Otherwise, we end up with a mess. But now what I want to do is, so we talked about what a project is, and we've talked about the 5 elements of a project, components of a project, whatever term you want to use. Now let's talk about the errors that are made here. The errors that are made here. Errors that we can't afford to make. We have too few people and too few resources to goof something up. We have to get it right. So let's talk about some errors. Let's talk about errors in scope. What are some errors that are made in the total picture of what needs to be done? When a group of men in the church takes on a project, what are some errors they could make relative to scope? Not realizing what all's involved. That's right, and I put that as number 1. Not taking the time to think through all that is involved in the project. Now, none of us are professional project managers probably, and when we take on big projects, they may not be within our scope of expertise. But we still have to take some time, whoever's leading it, and we have to think about all that needs to be done. Error 1, when no one takes the time to investigate the totality of what needs to be done. Let me give you a proverb here. Proverbs 27:23 says, "Be diligent to know the state of your flocks and attend to your herds." Be diligent to know the state of your flocks. He's saying you've got a responsibility over this particular thing, which in this case is a flock. You have to be diligent, hardworking, and paying attention to know what the condition is. Before we start a project, we have to know the state of the project. We have to know what's in the project. We have to know what we need to do. So not investigating. So if you're going to lead a project, or if we're going to talk about projects, and tonight when we talk about the emergency plan, part of what we're doing tonight is just starting to identify the scope. When we talk about this, what are we talking about? And then we need to limit that scope to something that we can do, something we can actually execute, because you can't do everything. But you have to start with the scope. What is, therefore, the best practice to overcome that error? You got to put the work in up front. You got to put the work in up front. When you are assigned something by the deacons or by the elders, you got to take the responsibility to put the time in up front. Don't just go out and start doing things, all right? Don't assume that you know. Put significant work in before a project starts in order to have a successful project. But sometimes there's another error that's made here. We don't investigate. But let me ask you this. In any project, let's take our emergency preparedness project. What other group in the church is going to have some thought or some ideas about what the scope of that project ought to be? We got the deacons, but who else do we have? Who's over the deacons? The elders. The elders are over the deacons. All right? So another error that happens here is a misunderstanding of scope between the parties. One group thinks we're doing this, and another group thinks we're doing that. So the group starts doing this, and the other group says, well, why are you doing that? I thought we were... You ever had that happen? I thought we were doing this, or why are we doing that? You remember that? Different understanding. How do we fix this? We have to establish between the parties that are involved, we have to agree on what the scope is. And we need to document that and make sure everybody has it. One of the things that we're doing in our elders' meetings is we are getting more and more organized when it comes to taking notes. And when we're done with a meeting, we have the notes updated, so we know we talked about this agenda item and this is what we agreed to. Because later on you're going to go down the road and you're going to say, well, I thought we decided X. So hold on, no, we decided to do this. Right here it is in writing. 1 Corinthians 14:8. For if the trumpet makes an uncertain sound, who will prepare for the battle? You see, if there's confusion in what is being communicated, that's kind of the point there. If we agree that we're going to make this sound before we go to battle, and then we hear a little bit of that sound, but we hear something different, we're going to be like, what do we do? So we have to be in agreement on things so that when we go to execute, in this case, talking about the battle, everybody knows what we're doing and there is no confusion. That's just a couple of errors for scope. Now let's talk about time frame. What errors are made there? Here's an error that I had pointed out. When we don't understand what it is, we don't have a time frame. You ever been in a meeting, and especially in the churches are terrible about this, and everybody talks about something we're going to do, and nobody sets a time frame for doing it? They just talk about it. It's just up in the air, and so we need to do that. Okay, let's do that. Meeting adjourned.
That's what I was talking about earlier.
Okay, why is that a bad idea?
It will never get done.
Because it'll never get done. And how many times have we been in church meetings where things don't get done?
Every church I've been to, that's...
It's another reason that I'm big, and I mentioned this, I'll repeat it, that when you go to a meeting, you need to take something to take notes. Because if you agree to do something, that is your word. If you say, I will, that's your word. You cannot break your word. But how are you going to remember if you don't write it down? How many of us have a photographic memory? None of us. So when Christians go to meetings, they don't take any notes. They have nothing to write with. They take no notes, but they commit to doing things. What are they doing when they leave and forget? They're sinning. It is a sin. If you say, I'm going to do something, and you don't do it. When not understood by anyone, or if there's a different understanding between parties, I think that came up also. So we've got to document the time frame and give everyone a copy. So when we agree to things, you'll usually find me in a meeting. I'll say, hey, so-and-so, can you do that? And I'll say, well, can you have it done by X? Try and be reasonable, but there has to be, and I write it down. Otherwise, what's the point in talking about it? So that's a no time frame or one that's not understood. All right, so another error that I wanted to point out here is sometimes when we talk about something, we like for example, tonight we talk about the emergency plan. It's going to be difficult for us to come up with a firm timeline tonight for really much of anything. Maybe there'll be some action items. But when we don't come up with a time frame, we don't make a decision about when we are going to come up. We just leave it open-ended. All right? So this comes up a lot I'll give you a particular lesson here. So let me write this down about the time. No decision about the time. Let me give you an example, and this is a little bit of a management lesson here. All right? Whenever you're asking someone to do something, now this is very important for deacons because think about it. One of the things that we have to do is recruit help. We got to get people to help us. Now, let me give you a best practice for recruiting people to help you. When you go to someone and you ask them if they'll help you with something, first of all, don't just do a broad, hey, we need people to help us, appeal from the front. That normally doesn't get you as many as you want. You have to go directly to people that you want. But when you go directly to them, one of the mistakes that's made is not getting them to give you either an answer, and then someone says, I need to think about it. Okay, so what do? You walk away. I need to think about it. Okay, that's great. You do need to think about that. It's no problem. But what happens if you don't do anything else at that moment?
Out of sight, out of mind.
It's wide open then. What do I do next? You're going, I asked him, but I don't know. What should I go? I'm going to offend him. No. Always, and this is when there's no decision about the time, always say, well, when could you let me know? Can you let me know by next Sunday? You see? Now you have a deadline where you can go back to them, and they have a deadline to give you an answer. Because we need to know. I mean, you're going to help us, help us. If you're not, it's okay, just tell us. Right. So whenever you're recruiting people, go directly to the individuals that you want. That's always more powerful than a broad call. And then always try and get them to give you an answer or give you a time when they will give you an answer. If they're not willing to give you a time frame, you ever met people like that? Yes. Just non-committal. I don't know. They just can't make up their mind. Move on and find someone else. Well, but think about it. If you pressure someone who doesn't want to do it, who is not reliable and you can't count on, and you pressure them and then you count on them to show up, what's going to happen? They're not going to show up. So you might as well cut your bait. You got your hook at the dock, and you're not going to get it out. Just cut your bait and move on. And there's a verse on that. Proverbs 25:19. Confidence in an unfaithful man in time of trouble is like a bad tooth and a foot out of joint. Well, what's a bad tooth? It's painful, and it's good for nothing. You can't chew on it. And if you got to get rid of it, you got pain, so you got, and then what about the foot out of joint? You can't walk on it. You see? So unfaithful, and that's what we don't want to be. We don't want to be unfaithful men. Faithful means you can be relied on and counted on. Okay? Means you show up on time. Means you do what you say you're going to do. Means you write down your notes. You're personally responsible. You're not waiting for somebody to remind you. I remind you guys of when we're meeting and all that because that's just good practice. But the fact of the matter is I shouldn't have to remind any of you. You are all faithful men. When you agreed to be a part of the training and we laid out the dates, you're on the hook to remember. Well, again, I'm not getting on you. I'm just saying, you see my point though, right? You shouldn't have to be reminded because you're faithful men. So, time frame. Always get somebody to give you a time frame, and if they don't want to, move on. Resources. I think this came up already. But what would be the number one error made in resources? Not getting enough. Not enough. Not enough resources. You guys remember this verse here? Luke 14:28. Remember what Jesus said regarding being able to finish a project? You remember this? For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? He's saying, It's patently obvious that you don't start something unless you have enough to finish it. Otherwise, you end up with half-built buildings or projects that aren't done. All right, now it is difficult to know the full cost. We don't do these projects every day for a living. You know, when we do construction projects, when we did the screen project, there were things that we missed. We just don't do it every day. We just didn't know to think about that, and then we got down the line and we were like, oh, shoot. So number one, we look at each other with grace and mercy because we're not professionals. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we're looking at our costs. What do we need to identify, to set aside to do this work? And as deacons, if we need resources that are beyond our authority, because we don't have authority in the church, we're servants, then what should we do? Let's say this emergency preparedness plan, and we come up with a scope of work and a time frame, and we're determining resources, and we determine we need X amount of money, and we might need some space, and we need these other things, but we don't have the authority to give ourselves that. What do? Bring it before the church. Go to the elders. Go to the elders first. Talk to the elders. And then the elders will take it from there. All right, components. Here's what I find there. The smaller parts of the project that make up the scope. Here, to me, you guys tell me if you think this is a common error. Whoever's leading the project or doing the project doesn't spend any time thinking about the components of the project. They just start working. Let's say that we said we're asking the building and grounds team to build some rooms over in the youth building. So the very next day, Ollie goes over there, and I'm not picking on Ollie because he would never do this, but just an example. Ollie goes over there and just starts hammering in 2x4s. Didn't think about anything, didn't plan anything out, didn't lay out the components and figure out all that had to be, none of that. You see what I mean? Just wing it. What's the problem with the wing it approach? What ends up happening when you just wing it? Chaos happens, the costs go up. Why though? You're right, I agree, but why? You're not organized. So yeah, you're going to make a mess. So I like to call myself a type AAA personality. I'm a goer and a doer. What are we waiting for? Let's get it done. But people like me have to learn to slow down and give it a little time. Let's get this thing right. So when we're dealing with projects and we're working together on projects, if you become a project lead and you're like me, what are we waiting for? Slow down, all right? Slow down. Don't do the wing it approach. All right, and then order. Order. What mistake is made here? The sequence of action required to complete the task. What mistakes are made here?
There's no order.
The same with the components, isn't it? Just wing it. Just get started on something. What's the problem with starting something out of order? You have to redo it. And how many of us have been building something or putting together a table or maybe building a wall or doing a roof, and you get almost done and you go, oh.
Which in short is a waste.
And you got to take the whole thing apart. But there's something else that let's put the wing it up here. Order is the wing it. Every project, one task at a time and only one task at a time? Is that the way every project has to be done? It has to be done 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4. Can nothing else be done at the same time? A lot of times it can. A lot of times if you plan it out and you're thinking about your sequence, if you got guys over here running, like when we put those youth walls up, and I knew we were going to have, 5, 6, 7 guys there. So even though I'm not as skilled as Luke, I knew that there were going to be things that we could have guys doing at the same time, because I didn't want to have a bunch of guys standing around and going, I don't even know why we volunteered to come over here. These guys aren't organized. This is a waste of my time. So the next time we ask them to do something, what are they going to do? No, sorry, man, I'm busy. So I spent quite a bit of time trying to get ahead. I got a lot of stuff prepped, and I thought about, okay, if Luke is putting up a wall with somebody, what can I have these two guys doing? What can I have these two guys doing? So that we're not just doing A, B, C, D, but we're doing A and B and C and D together. You see that? But if you don't think about it beforehand, you can't do that. So order and sequence becomes very important. Order and sequence becomes very important. So we have what a project is. It's any activity we take on to meet a need in the church. We have the 5 elements of projects: scope, time frame, resources, components, and order. And we have all of these little subtle errors that we don't want to make. That's the lesson for this evening.